Okay, so still in chapter 5, but now we're going to finish up one more part. It's an interesting segment, something that's important, and I don't know that I've got all the answers to this, but I want to kind of lay out the important points and hopefully get you thinking about where you fall on these ideas. And I always do this lecture the same, so I want to continue on with this way of presenting this material, but it has to do with using standards such as environmental standards, labor standards, or health and safety. I don't have health and safety standards written on there, but you can throw those into the mix. Using these standards as a mechanism for restricting trade versus using them because there's a legitimate reason to impose our standards on other countries. And I think I'll start with the idea of labor standards, because this one's pretty easy to work with. But it's one of the most problematic, and again, I don't know that I have the answers to these questions, but I do want to lay out the framework of the arguments and see what you guys think about it. Let's say that we are a committee in charge of coming up with a new rule. And because of abusive child labor practices, we're in charge of coming up with an age limit, an age below which children can't work. Okay, and it just applies to our country. It's just we're in charge of this country's labor laws, and we're going to pass a new law. You don't get to work till this age. This is the age at which people can start working. When I pose this question to my former classes, I always get a discussion that starts at around 16. That seems to be the age that people think that's when you should be able to get a job. Now, that's not universal. Sometimes people say 18, sometimes people say 14, whatever. But I think you may have all been kind of in that age range when you were thinking about when was my first job? When should children be allowed to start entering the workforce? When should they work? Even in economics, we talk about the labor force being 16 and older. And so that seems to be kind of our standard for when people should be allowed to work. Now, again, that's not universal in that I know that a lot of preteen girls, age 12, can actually perform babysitting duties. Many times girls age 12 are perfectly capable of babysitting, whereas 40-year-old men are not, which I think is kind of funny. So this idea that everybody should wait until they're 16 to start working, again, there's some exceptions. I was at age 12 mowing lawns in the neighborhood for some money, okay? But again, that seems to be our standard, that children shouldn't have to work. What should children be doing up until the age of 16 instead of working full-time jobs in sweatshops? Yeah, going to school, extracurricular activities, going to pool parties, having fun, learning, socializing, that kind of thing. I want you to think for a second about my mother's situation. My mother was born in the 1940s on a small farm in rural South Carolina. If you want to know where it is, it's a little community called Zion, outside of Mullins, which is outside of Florence, which is outside of Columbia, which is outside of Charlotte. It's a very remote location in the Piedmont area of South Carolina. My mother had 5 brothers and sisters. My grandfather had farmed his whole life, and he was a very proud guy, very quiet guy, one of those strong, quiet types. And he and my grandmother had 6 children. And why on a small rural farm in South Carolina did my grandparents have 6 children? Yeah, it's called chattel. Having children for the purpose of labor was a common practice in the Southeast. Matter of fact, a lot of my grandmother had 11 siblings, and they lived on a farm. And why were they all produced? Was it to put in bassinets and do little pictures, and then let them do extracurricular activities until they're 16 years old? No, they were put to work. And so the question is, at what age do you think my mother started working on the farm? I used to BS this. I used to just make up a number. And then a few Thanksgivings ago, I was at home, and I happened to be lecturing on this at the time. And I had the thought, ask my mother at dinner when she actually started working. Because I'd always figured she started working when she was like 5 or 6 or 8 or something. And so I'd just make up a number. And so I asked her, and she looked confused. And she goes, what are you asking? Well, how old were you when you started working on the farm? And she goes, I don't have any memories of not working on the farm. She said, when I was 2 and 3 years old, I was on the job training with her older sisters. And what were they doing with her? They were having her help out with the laundry and a lot of the household tasks that supported the farming operation. They were cooking the big meal lunch. That was part of that. And then by the time she was 4 years old, she was taking refreshments out to her older brothers who were actually in the fields working on the tobacco crops and things like that. And then she has distinctive memories of cropping tobacco, where you'd break the flower off of tobacco plants. And as soon as she was tall enough to reach up and grab the top of a fully grown tobacco plant, which is about yay tall, so she had to be about that tall. How old is that? 4? 3? 3.5. They're a pretty big family, and they're tall kids. You could get them working earlier because of that. So what would my grandfather, who was a man of few words, say to us if we said, hey, we're passing a new law that says children can't work until they're 16? What would my grandfather, Coke Hampton Rogers, what would he have to say to us? I imagine, even though he didn't say a whole lot of words, I think he'd have probably a few choice ones for us. A few of which might be something like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with them until they're 16? And we'll play catch. And what would happen to the farm? This was not a huge farm. I don't know if it was maybe 40, a couple hundred acres, top 100 acres. What would happen to this family of 8 people and their neighbors, some of them depended upon them, that they had taken in and that kind of thing? What would happen to that community if those children hadn't worked on the farm? It would have sunk. They would have been bankrupt. And what would the standard of living have been for my mother had she not been allowed to work at that early age? It would have been much lower and not higher. So when we start thinking about our standards, if we look around the rest of the world and we see other countries using child labor for certain tasks, be it agriculture or the thing about child labor is not too good for heavy industrial work. Why are children bad at heavy industrial work? They're not strong enough. They don't have the dexterity and skill and the strength, quite frankly, to handle kind of the big stuff. Although my mother, guess when she started driving? And as soon as she could reach the pedals, and even then she probably had like blocks tied to her feet so she could hit the pedals. As soon as she could kind of see where the steering. So she was actually operating heavy equipment. So really until they're 13 or so, 12 or 13, they can't really drive tractors and that kind of thing. But light commercial work, things like maybe sewing soccer balls together and stuff like that, they may start having dexterity to do that at a fairly young age, but for the most part, that comes a little bit later. But still, around the rest of the world, we might see children working at age 10 and 12, and they're perfectly capable at that point, like my mother was, of even operating some heavier equipment. But when we see that, and when we see kids making T-shirts in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, we call it sweatshops, and what do we say about their bosses and that work and that they're doing? Well, they're evil and they're using these abusive child labor practices, and we need to not support that. And that's a reason for not buying those T-shirts. We've got to be careful about making this an argument of morality. That we're better than them because today our children don't have to work. And that's true, isn't it? Very few of you, and even me, and I'm older than you, had to work when we were children. It was more or less just a hobby kind of job for fun. We didn't have to. So what was the difference? Why did my grandfather make his kids work and I don't make my son work? I'll tell you this, it's not because I'm of a higher moral stature than my grandfather. Quite the opposite. If it's not morality, then what is it? Well, the difference between me and my grandfather, who's now deceased, the difference is I'm richer than he is. And I'm not bragging, it's just a lot of people today are richer than he was because he was a poor farmer. So the difference is not that we're better, it's that we're richer. And when you're richer, what can you do with your children? You can let them play video games. You can send them to school. You can engage them in extracurricular activities, and you can even play some catch with them every now and then because you have that luxury. The question is, why am I so much richer than my grandfather? And a big part of that is because what was he allowed to do with his children? He was allowed to put them to work, but notice very few of them, actually none of them, became farmers. All of his children went on with this work ethic that they had developed as young children, which is still shameful. My mother can outwork the hell out of me. She's over 70 years old, and she comes to my house, she'll go out there mowing the lawn. Yeah, that's the way they are, right? She has this work, and that work ethic that both her and my father both got on their farm, their childhood farms, benefited them and allowed them to go on and be teachers and doctors and stuff like that. And what did that afford me? An education. So it's no mistake that I am where I am. My position in life is built on the backs of those practices. So what basically happened over the generations from my grandfather's and my great-great-grandfather's generations up through my parents was they became successful enough by using their children as workers. They were able to be successful enough to get wealthy enough eventually so that those kids no longer had to do that. And that's the way you get out of child labor, is through an economic growth and development process, not through this kind of let's hold hands and sing kumbaya and wish there weren't problems in the world position. So this very same thing we were doing one generation ago, one generation before me, the rest of the world is still doing in many cases. When I was over in India and Nepal, I saw a lot of children working in their parents' shops and doing that kind of stuff. And you don't really see that here. Not wholesale. But that's what they're doing. And why are they utilizing their child labor? Because it's extremely efficient to do so, and it allows those families to survive. The guide that took us on our trek, Arjun, his kids are the first generation that in his family that are going to college. But he's been working since he was a child. And his father worked since he was a child. But they're starting to transition now so that when his kids go off and get chemical engineering degrees in college and come home and have jobs, their kids will never have to work again. But all of that came from Arjun, our guide, having to work his whole life. And he was proud that that was the case, that he was able to pass that on to his children. So we have to be careful, because here's the problem. If we run around saying, hey, no children should work until they're 16, there's hypocrisy there, because we were doing it one generation ago. We also have to be careful of this idea that it's some kind of a moral or cultural superiority that we possess. No, we're just richer. And rich people are afforded the luxury of abolishing child labor, and poor people aren't. Finally, you have to be careful, because on that note, if you take away that child's first best alternative, what are the parents of those children left with? The parents of those children don't want their children to have to work, but they're allowing them to because it's the best alternative they have at their disposal. If you take that away, you don't get the video games and the extracurricular activities. That's not an option for them. They go down a step, not up. And what's down a step? Well, in Cambodia, 12-year-old boys pimp out their 8-year-old younger sisters to pedophiles. That's a job. It's not one we want to see. It's one that we need to eliminate. In Tanzania, warlords who are in the human trafficking industry steal children and send them down mine shafts that are about this big around, a couple hundred feet down, to mine this gemstone tanzanite to line their pockets with. And what happens to a lot of those kids who were 4 years old and tied a string around their rope or rope around their foot, lowered down these things, and they never come back out? Those types of abusive child labor practices need to be ended. But be careful about the ones that are in the middle. Be careful about the marginal jobs, like the light commercial work, light industrial work, agricultural work. That's the stuff that our kids were doing a generation ago. And if you take it away, just like if you took that away from my grandfather, all those kids would have been worse off, not better off. And we got to be careful. I'm not so sure that this idea that children should not work is really working out like we thought it would. We're so rich. Our kids don't have to work. I just realized that I do well enough in a job that I love that I could finance my son the rest of his life. Oh, I shouldn't have tape recorded that. I don't want this being used against me. I make enough money to where he never has to work. And heck, I'll have enough retirement for me and him when he retires from nothing because he wouldn't have to work. Is that what I really want for my kid? Yeah, and it's bad because if you don't really do anything until you're 18, you've never developed a lot of soft work skills and just good work ethic, good old-fashioned work ethic. And that kind of it's kind of like learning a foreign language. If you don't do it when you're young, sometimes it's very difficult to develop that later down the road. I think there's hope for the next generation. We always are more worried about these things, and people will learn how to, they'll develop these work ethics. They'll find their place, but it surely wouldn't hurt to have a little more of that maybe earlier on, and we've gotten away from that. Some big proponents of these kind of things are guys like Mike Rowe, Dirty Jobs guy. He's a big proponent of these things. He's got some good stuff online where he talks about trade jobs and things like that and how we've kind of gotten a little soft when it comes to work in this country. Maybe there's something there. Again, this is not justifying the type of child prostitution practices or the child trafficking. All of that needs to be eliminated. And in many cases, that's just crime. And in many cases, the governments in those countries turn a blind eye to that crime because they're enjoying the economic benefits of it. And those governments should be taken out as well. That needs to be ended. But we need to be careful about making soccer balls and shoes and sweatshirts, because then you get the term sweatshop, and you take those away. Take that sweatshop job away from that kid. What's left? Maybe that prostitution job is the next thing in line. And that's an unacceptable trade-off. So hopefully the type of child labor practices that we used in this country that are not abusive in nature, hopefully those allow an efficient production process that enriches countries and raises the standard of living to where we don't have to see that anymore. Although maybe a little bit of it's always good. How about environmental standards? Well, the same argument applies to environmental standards. If you look back in our history, when we were a poorer country, we had a fairly dirty environment. We weren't very clean. We kind of made a lot of messes. In Ohio, the Cuyahoga River was so polluted that it caught on fire. Now, whenever you can catch water on fire, something's going down, right? That's either biblical or a lot of pollution. And I think in this case, it was a lot of pollution. The Great Lakes were basically killed. All the life in the Great Lakes were just eliminated by the pollution levels in the lakes. We had examples of hazardous waste landfills, such as in Love Canal in New York, where nasty stuff was bubbling up into people's basements, and you had cancer clusters and all these kind of things happening. Smog, soot, air pollution, groundwater pollution. We pretty much fried everything out there. And there's a reason for that. When you're poor, you don't have the resources to clean up your messes. It's a very easy exercise you can do. If you're driving home and you happen to drive through both rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods on your ride home, look at the front yards of people in poor neighborhoods versus those in rich neighborhoods. Which ones are cleaner and neater? And there's a reason for that, isn't there? That's pretty obvious. The rich people have the resources to devote to having a manicured front yard and all that kind of stuff. And poor people don't have the time and resources to devote as much. So you might see cinder blocks and cars and jumped out in the front of 4 people's houses sometimes, right? Again, this is not a question of morality or laziness or anything else. It's just a simple matter of wealth. And what happens is, in countries like the US, where we develop economically pretty quickly in the 50s and 60s, we had a pretty rapid phase of economic growth post-World War II. And during that time, we started demanding more of a lot of things. When you get richer, you demand all types of new goods and services that you didn't have or didn't want as much of, couldn't afford when you were poor. We call these things normal goods. Normal goods are things like sports cars, steak dinners, TVs, houses, just about everything, clothes. Everything you buy is kind of mostly a normal good. Inferior goods are the opposite of that. Inferior goods are things like ramen noodles and used clothes at the Goodwill. Why do you buy ramen noodles and used clothes? Because you're poor. And when you're richer, you don't buy them as much. Those are inferior goods. But normal goods, you want more of them. Well, it turns out that a clean environment is a normal good. As you get richer, you want a cleaner environment. So when we had this economic growth in the 50s and 60s, around the 60s and into the 70s, we had become so rich as a country that we started wanting a cleaner environment. And so we started taking action, both public and private. Public action that we took, things like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Federal Superfund Act, CERCLA to eliminate hazardous waste, landfills and things like that. We started going up and cleaning up our messes because we had the money to do it. So just like we wanted to get rid of child labor, that's a normal good, we also want a clean environment. And so we go about it. And I actually worked for the EPA for 7 years doing hazardous waste landfill site inspections and cleanups. We wouldn't clean them up. We would rank them, which ones needed to be cleaned up first. When I started in 1991, we had a pretty good list of sites we had to get through in the state of South Carolina. By the time I went back to graduate school in 1997, we were out of hazardous waste landfills to clean up. It was amazing to see that progression in the 90s. But we were rich in the 90s. We had all kinds of resources and money. We were using a lot of them to clean up these hazardous waste landfills and to clean up these spills and things like that. If you look around the world, some of the nastiest environmental conditions are in the poorest countries because they haven't gotten rich enough to where we are. Once India becomes economically developed like we are, guess what? Their kids aren't going to be working as much, and their environment's going to be cleaned up also. But when I was in India last month, you would walk outside and there was so much pollution and smog in New Delhi, you couldn't breathe. You literally, even when you were inside, the air was just there. And in this really nice hotel I was at, they had all these candles and incense burning. And I realized it was to mask the odor of the pollution outdoors. We had stuff like that in a lot of our big cities, but again, the Clean Air Act has forced industry and emission standards on cars, and all of that has helped clean up those messes. But that's expensive, and poor countries can't afford it. So the same kind of arguments apply to environmental standards. So if we're going to restrict trade with India because we don't like that they're polluting the air, we got to be careful because we were doing it just 30, 40 years ago. And again, it's more to do with economic development than it has to do with morality. A lot of things can be lumped into this argument. One of my pet peeves is how people treat dogs in this country. Not that they treat dogs too poorly, but that they treat them too well. You know who I'm talking about. I had a friend who brushed her dog's teeth every night, like maybe twice a day, brushed the dog's teeth. And the dog slept in her bed, was able to go on all the furniture. And what was she treating her dog like? Like a child. In Vietnam, what's a dog? Dinner. Why is there a difference? Well, because we're richer. And when you're richer, not only do children not have to work and you have a clean environment, you also treat dogs like people. It's just the way people are. And someday you will see that in these underdeveloped countries. As they develop, they're going to start treating animals more. And now people buy health insurance for their animals here. If you go to India and you tell people there that you have health insurance for your dog, you're going to be ridiculed pretty steeply, pretty sharply. That's a luxury that we have here that they haven't even considered yet because they don't have the resources. Health and safety standards are basically the same argument. There's a general trend with products that we consume. The level of health and safety associated with those products, and more importantly, the price of those products. You can make an argument that the food at the fresh market is more healthy and better for you and safer, consequently, than the food you buy at Walmart or Kroger. But when you go to Fresh Market, you better take your bank with you because it's pricey. And there's a reason for that. Take a big, large, brand new Mercedes. It's got a bunch of airbags, it's got a really nice braking system, it's got all kinds of warning devices on it, it's got anti-crash stuff here, and it's got crumple zones, it's got all these things that make it very safe. Yet it's also very expensive. Compare that to like a Toyota Celica or something. Not quite as safe, but it's a lot cheaper. Do that with any product. The safer, higher quality stuff is more expensive, and it's because it has more stuff in it. It takes more resources, it takes more time and engineering and better materials and stuff to produce a safer item than a less safe item. So it's always going to be more expensive. So if we're arguing that something from another country is less safe, it probably is, but it's also a lot cheaper. And you and I, as consumers, tend to like that choice. Does everybody buy that nice, big, expensive Mercedes? What do a lot of us have to do? It'd be nice if everybody could have the Mercedes, right? If safety was an option for everybody. But if you're not rich enough, you got to get that Celica. But you still want that trade-off because that frees up money for you to spend on health care, to spend in other dimensions of safety that might be more important for you. And as long as you're a safe driver and wear your seatbelt, you can mitigate the risk of that slightly less safe car and use those resources somewhere else. So we kind of want these choices. We're constantly trading off safety for money. And we're trying to make that as best we can. When you make those decisions well, it's kind of like, I don't need to spend as much money on health care and health insurance as someone who's not quite as healthy as I am. I do need more accidental death and dismemberment insurance than normal people because I do some more things that might happen. Put it this way, if I die in the next year, it's probably because I've fallen off a cliff or something, because I'm spending a lot of time in the mountains and skiing and doing that kind of stuff. But I'm otherwise pretty healthy, so I may die of cancer or something like that, but I'm pretty healthy and I get checkups, and that doesn't seem to be my problem. Heart disease, I'm okay there. So where do I want to spend my resources on health and safety or insurance for me? Probably on the accidental death and dismemberment is a better use of my insurance dollars than on health insurance. So we're constantly making these trade-offs, and if we argue that stuff coming in from other countries is not safe, then you deny that choice to people, and it actually makes it worse off for consumers, not necessarily better off. That being said, if a product is extremely dangerous to consumers because of some malfunction or something like that, and there is negligence or criminality on behalf of the firm, of course you want to address those issues. But just the general trend that the cheaper things tend to be a little bit less safe than more expensive things, we got to be careful about accusing everybody of being malicious and trying to kill people. That's not really what's going on. It's people trying to provide you with transportation and understanding you can't afford the Mercedes. And so you're going to have to trade off some safety for some money there.